Amazing. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined so far. Really exciting to have you all. Welcome to our event celebrating Rachel Carson, Women of the Nature Movement. We are super lucky to have with us today three incredible women of the nature movement who are going to be sharing with us their stories and their experiences of being a woman working in conservation and in nature, the challenges they faced, the successes they've had, their visions for the future. It's a really great opportunity to ask some very interesting, aspiring, accomplished women all the questions that you've ever wanted to ask about how to get into the sector, what it's like being in the sector, and some of those big questions that are plaguing us every day. Hopefully some of you have been to some previous events, but if not, welcome to your first one. This whole week is really about celebrating the groundbreaking publication of Silent Spring, a book written by Rachel Carson that is seen to have heralded the start of the nature movement and drew public attention to serious threats to nature that we're still experiencing today. What's amazing and what still needs to be celebrated of Rachel Carson every day is that she was very much ahead of her time 50 years ago. She was a woman, she was a writer, she was a member of the LGBTQ plus community. She was making incredible waves 60 years ago. We're still learning more and more about her and her work every day and seeing the impacts of her work still surviving to this day. And so it's important that we mark her work and continue to question and consider the issues that her book Silent Spring dealt with. So today, just to quickly introduce our panel members before we jump into some questions. To begin with, we've got Mary Colwell. Mary is an author, campaigner, award-winning TV, radio, and internet producer. She spent the last 11 years campaigning for a GCSE in natural history, which was confirmed this year, which is absolutely unbelievable. She's a director of the charity Curlew Action, a role which often finds her in very male-dominated rooms, an experience I'm sure many of us are used to as well. And last year, Mary published her third book, Beak, Tooth and Claw, which addresses the complex issue of living alongside predators in Britain. Welcome, Mary. Then we have Celina, who is an intersectional wildlife conservationist and artist. She combines her role as an ecologist, a storyteller, and an award-winning photographer to harness empathy for change and advocate for biodiversity. That storytelling element is so important and so strong when we're talking about nature and conservation. So it's so fantastic to have with us today. And then lastly, we have Rhiane, who is a full-time, very recently full-time nature-friendly flower farmer. She worked in conservation at the RSPB for the last 4 years, and before that was working on a hill farm in rural County Durham. She's worked on species-specific satellite tagging, programming, during doing community engagement across the north of England before moving to focus on Westminster and in the RSPB policy team on that, to work on a variety of projects to do with climate change, nature-based solutions to climate change, diet and behaviour and offsetting. So a real broad range of experience there too. Welcome, so great to have you and to celebrate Rachel Carson and being women in the nature sector with you all today. To kick things off, just wanted to ask all of the three of you, can you tell us a little bit about how you started working in the nature movement and what drew you to this? And then we'll just kick this off looking down my screen with Rhiane. Over to you.
Yeah, so great question. I came into it through a slightly circuitous route, I think, really, in that I just didn't want to move to London. I saw all my peers moving to London, and I grew up in rural County Durham, and that was the last thing on earth I wanted to do, even though I pursued academia in a way that led me towards probably moving to London, but I just didn't want to do it. And the more people told me I should, the more I decided that that wasn't going to happen. So I moved back pretty much home to Newcastle, and this job popped up, and it was on the Hen Harrier project, all about satellite tagging. And I didn't really know much about the Hen Harrier at all, other than it was a subject that was really kind of woven with the area that I grew up in, County Durham, the uplands and kind of the hill farming community and all of that sort of stuff. And so I perchance kind of took the job, and it was all about community engagement. And that's really where I entered the conservation sector. It was all about translating quite complex ideas to primary school kids and to secondary school kids, and to, you know, talking to gamekeepers. And it was about having conversations. And I think that's where I entered the kind of conservation world and found my niche, because that's what I love to do. So have those amazing conversations with people. So mine was not maybe a traditional path, but it was about, kind of not wanting to go to a big urban sprawl, and find a way for me to use my skills for something that I was passionate about in a community that I was really passionate about.
Yeah, what a gorgeous answer. I think wanting to stay in I mean, I guess must have been brilliant growing up in such a rural area with such beautiful nature, and to have that inspiration. I think it's I grew up in a city, and having that inspiration is sometimes hard to find. So that's really, really interesting. And I guess also that element of having conversations being so powerful, something that Mary, Celina, I'm sure both of you can also relate to as well. Celina, can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into the sort of storytelling side and building on those conservations and your roles now?
Yeah, absolutely. In contrast to Rhiane, I grew up in Beijing, a huge city, 21 million people, absolutely no nature whatsoever. And I think I was drawn to nature out of deprivation. I don't know what it was, but I think just having grown up with there's very few birds in a city to begin with. Little to no nature to interact with, and luckily I still found a way to engage with it, and that was almost entirely through media, so documentaries, David Attenborough, all that kind of stuff. And I knew that I always wanted to work in wildlife conservation, so a very traditional path. I went and studied biology. I thought I was going to be a biologist and a researcher, and it wasn't until I had kind of already begun doing that where I realized, actually, I think where my voice is the most powerful and where I find the most joy is being out in nature and communicating it and telling these stories through visual storytelling, because I just kind of realized quite early on, people don't protect what they don't love. And the only way you can inspire that love, I think, is through emotions. And visual storytelling, photography, sound, everything, that's how we access people's emotions, access people's empathy. And that's how most people really make decisions. And so I decided, rather than pursuing academia full time, I went more into the storytelling route as a photographer. And now I also work in all other forms of storytelling, whether that's communications, producing, short films, all that stuff. And so that's how I found myself in the nature movement. But I'm still very much involved in the on the ground conservation work. But just, how do we get these exciting, hope inducing stories that countless people are facing on the front lines of environmentalism, and engage people in places who are in positions of power, or in positions where, they can vote with their wallet, or they can quite literally vote in government or on in a boardroom, and how those impacts can affect conservation on the ground.
That's so interesting. Both of you have that draw to communication and wanting to have those conversations, but in quite different ways. Just a follow-up question on that. Did you, after your academic studies, did you then, to get into the storytelling side, did you specialize? Are you self-taught? Did you take on more education?
I'm entirely self-taught. As a photographer, I think also, you learn from your mentors, or you learn from examples. And that's another great thing to discuss in this talk, is that there were very few women to look up to in that space. And also, through imagery, there are few women taking the photos. And so women across the world have been portrayed in a certain way when it comes to their relationship with nature. But I studied biology, then I did a master's in tropical forest ecology. I specialized in soundscapes. So Rachel Carson is, it's back to my roots as a scientist. But with the photography, that really was just because I was really lucky. I met some great people in the field, and just was a sponge and absorbed it all. Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
I think another big barrier to photography and all that, people think that you need to go do a degree and get the fanciest cameras. You've got a camera, you've got your phone. Anyone can go out and take powerful pictures.
Yeah, it really seems that so much is about passion driven, and if you have that desire to do it, then there's ways to do it, even if it doesn't have to be the most expensive way to do that. I definitely want to circle back to this idea of very few women to look up to in that space, because that's obviously very critical to what we're talking about. But until we do that, it'd be great to hear from you, Mary, about your experiences as well, about and how you got into this.
I suppose I'm different again in that I suppose my passion has always been ideas. I love ideas. I remember being really little and walking around a library and asking my dad what a philosopher was. And he laughed and he said, well, they're people who think about things. And I thought, God, that sounds fantastic. I'd love to spend my life thinking about things. And so this idea of thought, big ideas, really always appealed to me. And I also, my first love wasn't actually wildlife at all. It was rocks, and probably, to be honest, still is. I'm a geologist at heart. I have a rocky heart, I think. I absolutely love the story. I think the earth is the biggest storyteller. It's every single rock tells a story. And you can pick up any rock anywhere and just marvel at what it's telling you about earth history. And it was a very long, circuitous route. When I was at school, I did an O-level then in geology. I don't think you can do it anymore, actually. And I think it was me and one other girl, I went to an all-girls school, did geology, and it so inspired me. I wanted to go and do a degree in it. And I was told I couldn't. I think this is back in by then in the 70s. And they said, no, you mustn't do geology because that's just a man's subject. And you'll end up on a rig and that's all men. And do something, go and be a doctor or a lawyer and all that normal stuff that you're told you have to do. And so I didn't, actually. I did as I was told, and I went off and did a degree that was all based in physics and actually philosophy. But just couldn't park it. Couldn't. I went back. I worked for 2 years in London. I saved enough money. I went back and paid for myself to do a degree in earth sciences. And it was through the earth science degree that I got then a job in the natural history unit, eventually working on a big series that had lots of geology in it, and then slipped over, began to discover the wonder of the natural world in terms of its wildlife. And so I got through it probably very differently to anybody else. And from then on, I've been driven by stories and by this incredible desire to get people to read the earth, to read the signs, to connect the points, get the dots all joined up, and realize just what an extraordinary planet we live on. And you can do that through rocks, you can do it through curlews, you can do it through photographs, no matter how you do it. We just need to wonder and have awe again in this planet we live in. And that's how I ended up doing pretty much everything I've done.
Wow, that's pretty incredible, actually, to as a historian, to think about the need to fight for what you're interested in. I think is a really interesting point that I want to pick up on. Is that, I mean, you're further down your career now, and in many ways can now be a role model for younger women who are getting into the sector. Do you, when you look around now, looking at opportunities there are for women and looking at those degree pathways or professional pathways, do you see similar obstacles still remaining, or do you think there has been a lot of change since you were having to fight for your own education in that respect?
Oh, enormous change. I mean, literally enormous change in the actual going to do a degree and applying for jobs and so on. There is literally no comparison today as to when I did it. And it was much worse for people like Rachel Carson. So I think there has been a massive sea change. I'm not convinced that mentally we've moved as far as we have, if you like, legislatively, is that, you can say that word. But I think, when the very first job interviews I went to, almost the first question I had was, do you have a boyfriend and do you plan on getting married? Almost every single interview I went to. And I expected it. I actually just expected that. That wasn't something that I was shocked about, and I think that's unheard of today. When someone who works with you, Ellen Bradley, and I were chatting, she simply couldn't believe it when I told her. So in terms of that, things have moved on a lot. I constantly had comments, how can someone so pretty be so intelligent? If I had a quid for every time someone said that to me when I was in my 20s, you know, so things have changed. So don't think it's really bad. It's been a lot worse. Even when I've actually just written about this in my book that's about to come out in April. I ended up going to Antarctica. I won't go into that bit. In the 80s, when I finished my Earth Sciences degree, there was an advert came out in the Guardian newspaper that said they wanted Earth scientists to work at the British Antarctic Survey. And the advert said, only single men need apply. Right? And so I wrote to them and said, why? Explain to me why. I got a very stern letter back. You have to read my book to get the whole story. That said, because they said, we have to work together as a team, having women is disruptive, can cause all sorts of problems. They even said, this letter said, in countries that have more liberal views, they found that when they've taken women to Antarctica, particularly to overwinter or to stay, you know, and live there for a while, all sorts of unfortunate incidences have happened. Fortunately, in this country, we can still discriminate. I still actually have that letter. So just imagine the change that has happened. And it only took another year or two. I started a campaign. That was my first campaign, I think. Of course, it had been going on for a long time before I got involved, but it did change. And now the head of the British Antarctic Survey is a woman. So, you know, let's stop and look back and think, God, things are a lot better than they used to be. There's a lot still to do, but it's certainly a lot better.
That is a series of incredibly wild stories. And I guess a good thing that I think Rhiane, Celina and I were very much open-mouthed whilst you're telling those stories. So I'm glad that we are shocked.
Yes.
But that is wild. And I guess, I think it's so hard sometimes to almost really understand the change that has had to happen. Yeah. 60 years is not a long time. Which is great to see such change, but the fact that we're still having this conversation and there are still obstacles is terrifying in its own right. Rhiane, have you felt it throughout your career? I mean, both from a farming perspective, which is also very traditionally male, and working for RSVB, which is potentially more balanced, has more gender equality, a lot of women working at RSVB. Have you felt a lack of female role models around you?
So the farming industry is, so I worked on a County Durham hill farm from the age of 14 to bring in money. And I had an amazing boss, a couple of bosses who really took me in and treated me like family. But the comments that my male boss would get when we would go traveling around the County Durham and beyond the county lines to collect sheep or move sheep or whatever it be from other male farmers were really disgusting for a 14-year-old and a sort of 39-year-old man. And I was really not shocked at the time. I think now I look back, I think, good Lord, that is horrific. So that kind of contrasted to the RSPB, which has got much better gender equality. And I have had quite a lot of really strong female role models as bosses. They have been, and for two reasons, not only because they're incredibly knowledgeable and they take no shit and they will just absolutely power through because they believe that that's right, and they will bring you into the fold, which I think is a really important part of kind of women's history, is bringing other women in that community along. But also there have been a real kind of support for the sort of logistics of being women. So for instance, the RSPB is very good at like flexible working, and that's what's allowed me to become a flower farmer, actually, because I said, I don't want to work full time anymore. I want to do part-time work so I can pursue this thing that for me is the on the ground conservation work that I talk about doing. And that was just kind of accepted, and it wasn't a problem. And it's never been a problem because there's this understanding that, you know, people should be able to have flexible working. And a lot of that was through women having childcare and having to think about that as part of their kind of lives and their working lives. And so that has had a really positive impact for everybody, not just women in the organisation. But one thing I thought was really interesting about Mary's stories is, as horrifying as they are, is that I think in conservation there are, well, the way I have kind of experienced it, there have been two sectors. So there's that kind of the practical or sort of the policy and the thinking and the discussion sector. And then there's the on the ground doing the conservation work. And there are still so many barriers in that world. So when I was working in the hen harrier world and I was going to sort of the Northeast raptor forums and learning about satellite tagging on moors, they were, you know, it was always older men. And it was very hard to get into those, you know, bird ringing or whatever it was kind of groups. It was very hard to get the experience. You weren't necessarily taken seriously. And then there's the practical issues around, you know, whether you're on your period and there are no access to toilets for like 2 days straight or whatever it might be. And those things are, it's a brain kind of gauge change, I think. It's exactly what Mary is saying, that things may have changed, but our mentalities or our kind of, I guess some of it is habitual. We haven't necessarily really put thought into how to solve some of those. And they're not problems. Women having periods are not problems, but it's just the practical aspects to the field work that we might need to do, we might need to engage in if you want the science. That needs to be accessible for everybody. And it's not accessible. I don't really believe it is. There are still only kind of fewer women than there are men in that field. So I've had kind of two experiences of it, that really, really positive female role models who take absolutely no shit, because I think you probably have to. And then there's that other side of it, which is there are still very physical barriers. And I think a lot of that comes from that kind of mentality that maybe things haven't changed as much as we'd like them to.
That's a really interesting point, actually, about that physical barrier, because I think that's definitely not something that we talk about as a barrier to access. I think we often talk about barriers in a more sort of holistic sense, more emotional sense, not necessarily in a more targeted physical way. I'm going to put you on the spot. I mean, from that experience, were there ever moments where you go, actually, this very simple thing needs to change? Or do you think it's more of an issue of a longer term project of changing mentalities and bigger gender equality?
I think there is still a huge issue around us being comfortable about women's bodies. I mean, crikey, if we were all just comfortable about talking about periods, we'd go way, way better off as a whole. But that is a big problem. It was these sort of older white men who were not comfortable if you even mentioned that you're on your periods, let alone the entire concept of women bleeding. I mean, Christ alive, that was way too much to deal with. So actually there is a much broader point here, which is around education and comfort with women's bodies, and the fact that women's bodies are different to men's bodies, are different to trans bodies, and different people's lived experiences of their own body, and that we should just be putting things into action when it comes to things like field work. For instance, I wanted to take a really crazy job, which I'm probably glad I didn't get, which was like bait loading on a helicopter for one of the kind of major eradication projects out on like St. Helena and things like that. But I had to really think about the practicalities of that, and whether actually for me it was very much a kind of, was it a barrier? Am I embarrassed about my body? All those kind of internal things. So it's both the mental and the physical side of things that I think is really important.
Well, that's so interesting. I don't even think I would have stopped to think about that being an obstacle. I guess once you're in the situation that you're then suddenly confronted with that. And I guess that's part of the problem, right? In terms of access of until you're in a very specific situation like that, but then it leads to more. I mean, Celina, you've done a lot on the ground as well. And especially through, I can imagine you've been to some pretty remote places as well, having as a photographer and storyteller. Like, tell me more about your experience from that perspective as well.
I was just going to add to Rhiane's points about like a lot of the barriers that I faced are both systemic from like the scientific community, or just outright like in terms of organizational or discrimination, prejudice, philosophical things like that. But also there's a lot of like physical barriers, and I feel like a lot of women that have preceded me in my industries have not particularly been allies, and actually quite often they are some of them the most active agents of discrimination. But unfortunately, which is exactly why, like, I feel like in our generation is changing so much, because I'm constantly thinking, how can I collaborate? How can I bring other women into this? How can I leave the door open? How can I, but like one of the biggest things is just dialogue, open dialogue, and openly discussing about some of these issues, and how, for example, like it is an undeniable fact that there are physical differences between, you know, like a male or female body when it comes to when you're in the field, whether you menstruate or whether you don't, or, you know, how, like what kind of gear that you can carry, and also the dangers that it entails to have a certain physiology. I always get asked by people, you know, what's the most dangerous animal that you've encountered? And I always say men. I have only ever faced like actual physical fear for my life danger from other men. I have, you know, I have been in plenty of like difficult situations, especially like with wildlife, but in terms of like frequency and how normalized it is, it's absolutely when you're at a field station in the middle of nowhere with no way of contacting anyone and you're only around other men. And so, of course, it's things like, you know, do we have the resources to take care of ourselves hygienically with you know, menstruation? But it's also understanding, like for me, for example, a lot of it was understanding that there are certain limits to what I can do. And a lot of the time, a lot of people kind of try to like reject their femininity in certain situations and try to like put on like, I am just as strong as everybody else and I can be the masculine person and and I tried to do that in the beginning, and in the end all I was really doing was trying to attain this like white male colonial explorer in the jungle stereotype. And actually there's so much power in being and accessing feminine energy, and so much power in just to say, you know, I, for example, as a photographer, like here's one of my pictures. It's a very classic style, my style of photography, which is wide shot. And that's also in part because I cannot physically carry a long lens in the jungle. It is too heavy. And like, of course I can, but I don't want to. Like, and that's just like, I spent years being like, no, I can carry the 600 millimeter with the tripods. I can do it. And at a certain point, I was like, honestly, why am I doing this? I'm just going to work my way around it. And now it's my style of photography just is actually does reflect, and it reflects my background in ecology and how I like to take the bigger picture. But it's also, it is part of who I am in the sense that like, I don't really want to heave all this heavy stuff up this mountain just because I need to prove myself in a certain way. So there's just so many of these like physical, mental, emotional barriers a lot of the time, especially in like photography. You know, especially if you're going to a particularly dangerous area, there are going to be more insurance implications and also precautions that you need to take as a woman, and quite often that will incur like slightly higher costs for your editor or commissioner or whatever, which is ridiculous because it honestly should just be like equal cost regardless. And so sometimes people don't want to send you out there because they're like, oh well, if it would be cheaper for me to send a man because you don't need another like security unit or whatever, then I don't need to do that. So it's just, yeah, it's very, there's so many things. And like also to add on to like what Mary said about, you know, it has changed, especially here in the UK. But as someone, like I grew up in many different countries and I quite often have to work in different countries where people don't want to take instructions from a woman. People refuse to listen to a woman. People refuse to, I've been in situations where men have refused to even engage and speak with me. Or they've assumed we're on an expedition, I'm the only woman, they just like hand me their laundry bag. I'm like, actually, no, I'm the leader here. Like I'm, or, you know, just, or these little things. Obviously you take it in stride and there are cultural differences all over the world. But, you know, it has changed here in the UK. enormously, but it hasn't for many places in the world. And I've worked in countries where it's illegal for me to leave a hotel room by myself, so there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, from all three of you, the number of very sort of stereotyped stories that you have to share, that both from starts of careers and all the way through. It's pretty eye-opening to think that we're still talking about the same stereotypes that there were 60 years ago that are still happening today. I mean, the very simple anecdote of people handing over your laundry, it feels very like women in the kitchen style joke is going to come after that as well.
And also there's like the additional interplay of race there, because it's quite often all the other people on my team are usually white men. And so not only is it the woman, but it's also the woman of color, and especially Asian women. There's a whole stereotype of being submissive and in careers of service, hospitality. So there's just endless ways where we can be discriminated against. And also, it's a whole like another thing, like, especially when I was more embedded in the wildlife photography industry, the first question I always get is, how are you going to raise a family if you're always in the field? I'm 23, like I was getting, this is people still ask that quite regularly, quite openly. Or if you're in a space, for example, recently, like last year, I placed in Wildlife Photographer of the Year. There's always a big like ceremony and event, and all the photographers and everybody's in the same room. And there's just like a natural divide that happens where it's like, oh, the men start talking to each other and they're like, okay, now you go talk to the wives and girlfriends. And I'm like, no, I am here just like I deserve to be here. I deserve to be in this circle. And it's not fair that it's only the really confident women who like stick their elbows out and push their way into rooms. Like, of course, they're amazing trailblazers, but it's not fair that those are the only women that can succeed in these worlds. And the whole point is giving everyone the choice and giving every kind of personality and every face and every gender an opportunity to thrive in an environment.
Can I come in on that? Because I think that's such an important point that I have my experience of, particularly standing up against maybe, for instance, a senior leader who, you and many other people are in opposition to because you think that they've done something wrong. You have to be prepared. I felt that I had to be prepared to lose everything in order to stand up for the person who maybe didn't have that voice. And I have noticed that because I agree that sometimes we feel maybe afraid to talk about how actually other women can sometimes be like real barriers, but I have been so fortunate in that I've also really experienced other older women who, good God, they have championed my voice as a younger, particularly at the very, very beginning of my career. And I have found that to be such a confidence builder, because you need somebody just saying, no, you're on the right path, keep going. But then when it came to my turn, I was like, oh my God, this is my turn to do that. And I thought, I've really got to be prepared to potentially lose everything job-wise and career-wise in order to say, no, I really think this is wrong and I really think this is right. And it can be very, very difficult, particularly if you're in a sector where it can be really hard for, we've just articulated all these barriers. I mean, there are lots of opportunities as well, but we have articulated a lot of barriers. So I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, Celina, there with that, because that can be really difficult when you do want to speak out. You've got to have the confidence in your conviction and be prepared to just be that really quite difficult person in the room, and that's quite a frightening thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry.
No, please, Celina, go for it, please.
And of course, being a woman, you're labeled as like loud and bossy and arrogant. And if any man did that, it was just, oh, well, they're strong in their conviction. So it's having to factor in perception as well as what you believe in and what you want to do and what you want to achieve.
I think that idea of imposter syndrome is something that probably we can all relate to, I think, no matter what field you work in, but I think especially when your field is dominated by white men and you're also dealing with sort of those additional barriers on top of being female, of also of prejudice against race or against nationality or culture or ethnicity, and having that on top, having those additional prejudices, sort of there's this endless layering of burdens. And I think from listening to the three of you as well, I think what's really poignant is what's come out on almost every question and everything we've discussed so far is that denial of opportunity, which seems to be really rife, you know, from 6 years ago and still going on today. And that seems to be the most outrageous. I mean, through all of your experiences of having that additional burden or standing on the precipice ready to lose everything, do you think that women have an opportunity in that respect to open more doors for those that follow? Which is great. To please do jump in, anyone who wants to reply to that.
I completely agree with that, and I think as I've gone on, I totally recognise what's been said, but I think as with perspective of age, you also realise that you have enormous power that you don't realise that you have, and that actually I've been quite surprised that people have stopped to listen, and because you're different, because you're speaking out, because you're prepared to stand up, you know, and I think don't underestimate that power. And if there's something that I would like to say to young women coming through now, try not to give this stuff a second thought sometimes, because you can change the world. You really, really can, you know, just so as long as you feel that passion that drives you forward. If you don't feel that passionate, and it's the same for men as well, I think, you will get buffeted around. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure on young men. I have 2 sons in their 20s, and they feel a lot of pressure from different ways as well. But I think never be the victim. Never, ever, ever let yourself be the victim. Even if you know you're being set aside and treated differently, you're not. And you have something important to say, and say it. I mean, just recently, you know, I've been in battles to do with the GCSE and told, oh, stop rocking the boat, you know, you'll upset people. You just have to get that confidence as you grow older to put yet another big brick in your handbag and start swinging it, mate. And really don't worry so much about what people think. It's so easy to say with a perspective of been through quite a lot of that. But believe me, if you do, you won't get pushed off your path. You will only find a much firmer path forming ahead of you. So it is a matter of confidence, and it is a matter of not having a victim head on as well. And I think of being the strong women, talented, beautiful women that you are, and just doing it. I love that Nike. I don't like Nike, but I love the slogan, just do it. It's always been, I think, the thing that's been imprinted in my heart. Just do it. Because if you don't do it, it might not get done.
I think Mary's raised a really important point here as well about not having conversations in silos. So some of the most, because that exact advice that you've just given, so I'm in business with my mum running the flower farm, and that is exactly what she said word for word to me. Is like, don't underestimate how much power you have, but you have to have those conversations. And I think one of the most powerful things that we can do as women, and you know, with whatever intersections we bring to the story, is to be in conversation with people who are not like you, who are maybe who are maybe queer, or who are older than you, or are from a different race or a different background or a different community, and to have those conversations, because those really help with the imposter syndrome. Let me tell you that, because we're all just here to support each other. And actually it makes you much, much more brave when the time comes, because you've got all those amazing voices telling you that you can do it. And that is the best thing about, well, for me, it's been the best thing about women in conservation, really. It's that those people have heralded you and helped you and given you that exact advice, Mary. So yeah.
And I also think be very sure that nobody is free of a backstory, whoever they are, whatever their gender, whatever their race. Everybody comes out of a difficult time, actually, and we're all battling in our own way and with our own demons and with our own sort of things that impinge on you. But never assume anybody else's life is easier than yours. And I think that's a very powerful thing to take with you as well.
One thing my mother has always said to me is, you don't know where people have come from and you don't know where they're going. And I think that's really critical to all of this, really. I always fear though I always have these conversations with women, and I think that's definitely something that I realize is that actually need to start having these conversations with more of my male friends, so it doesn't just end up being this closed loop of, which is an amazing, women supporting women and opening those doors and helping each other. But I think there's definitely, when we're sometimes I think we forget to go beyond our circles of understanding and empathy, and actually making that reach across to someone else's experience or what intersections they have and sort of what life they're leading. Sometimes we forget to do that or get too worried about how to say it in the right way, or that we're going to make a mistake along the way. And that I think we're also aware of the vocabulary that we use as well, and how do we make sure that we just keep having conversations and don't sort of tie ourselves up in knots as well. It's a tricky one. I'm going to just look at the little chat now. I think we have some really great questions come in, so I'm going to head over to that, although I have a million more. Just been writing hectic notes as we go, so lots of questions still here. But I'm going to kick off. Ellen sent in a question saying that gender is one potential barrier to engaging in nature and nature protection, but there are others, as we have discussed already throughout this panel session. So is there a way we can level the playing field for everyone? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this one in particular.
That's a big question. That's
yes.
Like, we solve all of the world's problems.
Like one of the things that we can do to level the playing field.
I think like it starts so early. It starts like education from such an early age, and encouraging all types of children to engage with nature. I mean, this is the thing. It's like I live my life with this belief that every single human being is born loving nature. Like you can't meet a child that doesn't like animals or doesn't want to look under the rocks, and and it only gets, it's like at a certain age when there's certain social pressures, or that some of them start losing interest, or it's not cool for guys to like flowers, all these little things. And so it's just leveling the playing field by encouraging and like active engagement and reaching out to communities, and like making sure that school children from predominantly communities of color have access to nature, have ways to engage with nature and enjoy it, and have a positive association with it. And it's the same for young men, and it's also the same for, also for young girls. Just like taking a leaf out of nature really is also able to put your like social pressures and anxieties in perspective. I know that massively helped me when I was in school. And so it's really working with kids, and it's the active engagement rather than waiting for people to engage with it, if that makes sense.
Hence the GCSE in natural history, because unless you put it in schools so that everybody has access to it, you
Absolutely.
can't assume it's going to, otherwise it will stay very white and middle class,
Exactly.
because that's a matter of just money and access. And so making something that is a fundamental right, that every child has access to the natural world and has a right to know about it, whoever they are, wherever they've come from, that's the only way we're going to do it, is mainstream it for everybody.
I really agree, because when I was doing community engagement work in both primary, secondary schools, sixth forms, gamekeeping colleges, it was like, we haven't got time, it's not in the curriculum, we just cannot make time for your half a day visit to the moors to see this. And that's such a shame, because actually those it can just be one moment that sparks a lifetime of absolute adoration for nature. Only has to be that tiny glimpse of something to somebody else could be completely mundane, and you're just bowled over by it. And actually for me, I was thinking about what you guys were saying when you were introducing how you got into nature, and I didn't even know I was really that interested in nature until I started maybe working in the conservation sector, and it just became this like, how could you be so just obtuse to this, that this thing is so beautiful and incredible and amazing? And so that access point is just absolutely vital. So I'm so glad all the work you've done, Mary, on the GCSE, because I think it's the most important thing, is to start people very, very young and give them that access.
Yes, thank you, Rhiane. And I think there's an awful lot of lost love out there. that kids don't know, families don't know, and it won't happen quickly. And we all want change overnight. We always do, but it won't happen quickly. But it will happen if we just slowly lay out the cloth ahead, you know, and it will happen. And you have to believe it will happen, and then you put the energy into it. If you think you're always battling something that you're going to lose, you'll run out of steam. So you're exactly right. It takes just those moments of wonder to get that ember burning that will keep you going for a long time. You can't do it. You can't live in your head the whole time. You have to live as a member of this planet, and it should never ever be degraded, ever.
I think what's really fascinating about that, and thinking even from a UK Youth for Nature perspective, you know, what we campaign on is for policy change, is for changes to legislation. We often find ourselves thinking it from quite a large scale, sort of national or perspective, and sometimes regional, sometimes local. But I think what's interesting when you know, catching myself thinking from a campaign's point of view, thinking it's all inspired by a wonder of nature, but in reality, when you start talking about policy, the wonder has gone. And you're talking about very, very, you know, sometimes quite dry, practical things about pesticides and what pesticides are, and you get into real technical details and you lose that wonder. I think that's a really interesting disconnect, that nature is one of those rare areas where actually thinking about access and thinking about engagement on a very individual level is really important, because only through that will we manage to sort of capture that wonder within wider policy and legislation, which is so missing right now. I mean, some of the decisions that we're seeing coming up, it's so clearly a lack of void of that wonder and void of that understanding of that wonder and how important that is as well. I just want to whilst we're on the subject of education, Mary, it'd be great to know, it's been a really long battle that you have now successfully fought, or you're almost there in terms of getting that rollout. Was there a moment, like a clinch moment for you, sort of 10, 11 years ago, when you realized that this battle needed to be fought?
I think it was queuing up for a cup of tea at the BBC, when I was a producer at the BBC Natural History Unit for 25 years. And I think I was queuing up for a cup of tea, and it just kind of dawned on me that I just read something in a paper about David Attenborough had commented that most children don't know what a blue tit is or something. And I was thinking, God, does that really be true? And then that just sort of simmered away, I suppose, in my brain for a while. And then I left the BBC and started to work in the conservation sector, and found myself sitting in a meeting completely nothing to do with anything other than, I can't remember, it was nothing to do with education anyway, and sitting next to Tony Juniper, who's now head of Natural England, and just literally turning to him and said, Tony, should we do a GCSE in natural history? And I have no idea where it came from. It was like, you know, one of those cartoons when the light bulb goes off above your head. And I thought, blimey, where but it was almost like it was voiced, and therefore it was out there. And once I'd said it, I literally could not let it rest. It gnawed away at me, and it went through all kinds of stops and starts. And I had a flurry of activity and excitement. Oh, this, you know, obviously people are going to see this as such a great idea. And it just fell off cliff after cliff after cliff. And I was told so many times, don't even think about it. They'll never say yes. Education's been through so much upheaval. You'll never do it. You know, we've had COVID, we've had wars, we've had changes of government, we've had everything. There's always been a major reason not to push it forward. And you cannot let anything, so many people said, this isn't the right time. There's too many other big things to think about. And you just have to know this is the biggest thing for you to think about. And so, well, you might not want to think about it, but I haven't finished thinking about it. And I'm going to keep thinking about it. And in fact, I'm going to do more than think about it. I'm going to really damn well shout about it. And if you do that, if you just keep going, eventually someone listens. And it was only when Caroline Lucas talked about strong women who are role models for people coming up, contacted me by direct message on Twitter, nearly fell off my seat, saying, I love this idea, can I help? All the doors opened. And as soon as you have access to power, you and I have no access to power. You've got to be in the corridors of power to be able to open those doors. So if you want to get someone done, find yourself a friendly politician. It won't happen without them. But Caroline Lucas was just magnificent. And then on, it was just shouting a lot. And you got two handbags swinging. That's quite powerful. And then we had someone from OCR come in as well, Tim Oates from OCR, the exam board, and then we had the trio that had enough of the skill and the passion to push it forward. But there were a lot of stop-starts, there were a lot of disappointments, there was a lot of negativity around it for a long time. And so I do remember the one point where I was doing loads of other things, and I was sitting at this exact desk, actually I'm sitting at now, and I had a pile of things on my desk here that I knew I had to, and the GCSE was always going to the bottom of the pile. It was about 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember looking at it thinking, I'm not sure I've got what it takes to keep battling with this. I've had so many rejections now from everybody. Is it worth another push? And I just thought, well, you know, if I don't push it, who's going to pick it up? And that was that last push, I'll give it one more go. I remember that so clearly, I'll give it one more go. And that's when, just after that, Caroline got in touch. So yeah, if I'd known it was such a battle, I'd still have done it, but I would have been a lot wiser, and I would have probably not let it get to me quite so much. But
it sounds like many well-deserved holidays should have been taken throughout that whole period. I hope they were. I mean, thank goodness that you did. I think it was incredible to see that, you know, the fact that all three of you have basically said education as being the main leveler and the key leveler, that it's fantastic that we have this now, that a woman and several women as well have opened that door to be able to have that as a springboard. I think it'd be so interesting to see in the next 10 years how we can then use that to keep opening doors for other young people, and for not just for women as well. I mean, that's a really clear example of sort of women joining forces. I mean, circumstantially, Caroline Lucas didn't need to be a woman to have made that impact, but definitely is a really clear example of women joining forces. And Annabelle, you've asked this question in the chat as well about, and I think we've discussed this a bit too, but if there's anything anyone wanted to add, Annabelle's asking, have you found that in each of your respective areas, joining forces with other women has helped to amplify your messages and your campaigns?
I have from a sort of nature-friendly farming perspective. So I've been so lucky because, interestingly, in the UK, most of the nature-friendly flower farmers tend to be women, and they tend to be growing on a small amount of land that they can control, which has been really interesting. And the support as a young person wanting to learn how to grow whatever it might be, and to do that alongside nature, has been absolutely amazing. And it's exactly what we were talking about earlier, where we were discussing kind of that community of women from like multiple different backgrounds, all bringing such interesting, diverse experience, like ex-lawyers, ex-teachers. I think that's one thing that's really, really important, is never underestimate the skills that you have, because we put so much weight on like transferable skills, whatever those are, but actually you've definitely, every single person who's watching this will have an amazing skill that you can bring to campaigning, or to policy change, or to education, or simply just to communicating why you love nature. And that, bringing that into that space is amazing. So I've been really, really fortunate that I've had so many women from so many different backgrounds encouraging me, and also sharing resources. So for instance, we have a pesticides group, and we try to think about, you know, what change we can make as 6, you know, not landowners, land renters, and whether we can affect some kind of change. Goes back to access to land and all that sort of stuff. But sharing those resources between people, and that network that Mary was just mentioning there, about maybe somebody else knows you know, an MP, or whether it's, you know, someone high up the chain in a big pesticide firm, or whatever it might be, all those things are really, really useful tools. So always bring all the skills you have, even if you don't think you have them, and create that network, because you never know who else might be in that network.
Exactly. Don't think you've got to change the world on your own.
Go for it, Celina. I saw that.
No, I was gonna say, I was like, this is one of the things, trying to work in isolation, trying to do everything. I mean, I am like a hyper independent person, and it has helped me in many ways, but it's just collaboration, working together, and also it just makes everything so much more fun. And sustainable, energetic, like in terms of how much energy and how much passion and how much you can give to a project or to a cause, amplified by working with people that you are excited to be alongside, that you respect, that you can learn from, that you can be challenged by. And it just makes it so much more fun, because there's no sustainability to a movement if it's fueled entirely from indignation and anger. Like, it has to come from a place of love. It has to come from a place of nurturing. And I think, not to make that particularly gendered, but I think women are very, very good at that. And fostering community. And it's the reason why, you know, whenever in the world of like sustainable development, empowering women in communities, it lifts the entire community. It lifts families and school systems and the whole infrastructure of a community, rather than just an individual or just one family. So I couldn't agree more with everyone here about the importance of community and collaboration.
And don't be afraid of those what's called the soft skills. It's kind of a bit of a derogatory term in a way. Oh, we don't do the hard stuff, men do all that. Every single person listening to this, every single person on this planet appreciates soft skills because we're just human beings, and we all are human, and we all respond to love and empathy and understanding. It's we always have, ever since we've sat around campfires and sung together. As you know, we're storytellers, we're lovers, we're parents, we're friends. You know, we are enemies, we're everything, all in one. And these soft skills recognize that we're more than just an economic unit or a scientist with, you know, a very logical brain. That is not a human being. We're all that, and be proud of that. Be proud of the fact that you are somebody who celebrates that and can use it to great effect. Don't see it as a negative. See it as a powerful weapon.
And that's just another extension of like misogyny, really, to associate soft skills with negative things. It's the same thing whenever I speak to people like, oh, but you're getting very emotional, and I'm like, but it requires emotion. You know, if we didn't have our emotions, we would destroy the planet to like in perpetuity, and we wouldn't do anything about it.
And each other.
Sorry?
And each other.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's just one of those things, like, particularly as in my experience as a photojournalist, there are like, one of the things that I love to do is working with women and photographing and telling stories from the perspective of women, because first of all, we're not hearing their perspectives, but it also is one of the few ways where I have an advantage in the world. You know, it's people are far more willing to speak to someone like me because I just seem less threatening, I suppose. But people are more open, more trusting, more willing to share their stories, and you uncover these beautiful, beautiful stories and moments, and it's about how translating that, and through photography, that still grants people their dignity, which a lot of photojournalists don't do very well. But it's, you know, it is also a great power. The number of times I've been a mediator in a room, even though that's not at all my training, it's just an incredible power. So use it.
I'm sure people know about that from working with the uplands and the upland community. That's boy, your soft skills needed in that community.
And just very quickly on that, one remaining question that's in the chat, specifically on upland communities, which maybe is one for Rhiane too, but Samantha had a specific question for Mary about, you know, despite huge improvements in the UK for gender equality, did you really feel that imbalance when you're engaging with the traditional rural community when you're researching for your latest book?
Yes, of course. And I think there are very traditional communities where it is where men still are the dominant force in it. There's no doubt about that. And some of the field jobs like gamekeepers and so on are overwhelmingly male. There are a few women, but not many. And I think that's like diversity in any form, of any role of life, in any job, in anything. Diversity is only a good thing, because you can become terribly locked into a way of thinking if you don't have diversity and you don't have an appreciation of different ways of thinking about things. I mean, Rhiane's probably done far more of it than me, but the desire for conflict and dominance is very, very destructive. And I think I think that comes from all sides of this very toxic upland debate, all sides. It's not one side or the other, it's everywhere. And I do think the more women get involved, the more diversity there is in the uplands, the better it will be. I really do think that's a very important thing. It's white, male, and aggressive on the whole.
I've had many conversations at game fairs and just with gamekeeper colleges, and actually when I used to do talks all across north of England to kind of local communities about the loss of their hen harrier and kind of illegal persecution of birds of prey, I'd pretty much every single talk would be like 50 people, but there'd always be a gamekeeper or a landowner in the room who would come because it was the topic that was controversial and they kind of, you know, wanted to engage in that controversy. And actually, there's a huge power in disarming people by being incredibly nice to them, but also finding those points of commonality. So for me, my tactic was they would give you some question that was basically unanswerable because it meant you had to concede something. But actually there is a little bit of power in that concession. And so I would say, oh, I totally understand where you're coming from, because I've worked in the uplands as a, you know, as a beater on a grouse shoot before in my life. And it totally upends people because they're just like, oh, hang on, I wasn't expecting someone to kind of hear what I'm trying to say. And then from that point, you actually get to engage in a proper conversation. And what's more important is you do that in front of a room of 50 other people who maybe are completely diametrically opposed to them in their opinions. So there is that, exactly what you both said, Mary and Celina, about that kind of soft skill, which again, as you're right, it's a totally horrible way of phrasing it, but that conflict management and that kind of the power in finding those connections is really possible. So I wouldn't feel totally dejected about the idea of having to have those difficult conversations, because some of the best conversations I've ever had have been with gamekeepers where we've made the most progress. Yeah,
undoubtedly.
Incredible. We are really unfortunately out of time, but I think it's been an incredible discussion, and thank you so much everyone, to all three of you, to our three panelists, for your contributions, for the work that you have done, continue to do, and will go on to do as women of the nature movement. It's been such an inspiring session. I think key takeaways for me have been emotions are powerful, collaboration is key, let's start with education, let's keep this conversation going, and make sure that we are reaching across any boundaries or obstacles that we see to make sure and to keep fighting, and also to keep metaphorical rocks in our bags at all times so that we can make the best change possibly can. Not real rocks. But thank you so much, everyone. This has been so great. Thanks everyone for joining. Do join us on socials if you enjoyed this one, and also to follow up on more events like this in the future. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening, and see you at the next campaign.